My name's Aaron Kacharski. I do some work with Recovery Advocacy Project. We're a network of individuals across the country that are working to help boost advocacy skills. We tend to think and act locally from that grassroots up sort of mentality. There's a lot of fantastic organizations, including partnership, that do some fantastic work on the federal level and on the state level as well. All of that adds up in our advocacy work. And so if you are just beginning your advocacy journey, this is one of the best trainings that you can take. And if you have seen some language trainings before, welcome back. This is a very good refresher. This was originally developed years ago by an organization called Faces and Voices of Recovery, but there's more and more tools to help with language and crafting our public narrative that we've kind of collected over the years. Denise has found some fantastic pieces for family members. I work a lot with people in recovery and family members in terms of just helping folks to find their voice. We know that a lot of people want to speak out, right? Sometimes we speak out and it doesn't quite come out the way we thought it would. And sometimes our messaging can be it's not getting the message across that we're trying to get across, and that can be frustrating. And so we're really gonna look at some language and phrases and words. And today we're gonna ask you to write like a couple sentences, a quick paragraph about why you're choosing to speak out. And so just kind of keep that in mind as we're moving along about why you're working to speak out as an advocate. It's your story, right? We're all here for different reasons, and there's a uniqueness to that. But then also, we want to take people's lived experience, the unique lived experience, and combine it with some consistent messaging, because I'm sure that Denise has had this too. Sometimes we talk to elected officials and they're like, yeah, we hear from people, but we don't really know what you want because the messaging's kind of all over the place. And so as a community, let's work to fix that together. And so that's what this training's about today. Next slide, Gary. And I just wanted to give Denise a minute to introduce herself as well, and then we'll move forward.
Thanks, Aaron. So happy to see so many familiar faces here today. It fills my heart that you keep on coming back again and again. For those that don't know me, I'm Denise Mariano. I am the Director of Family Support and Advocacy at the Partnership. Prior to the Partnership, I've been kind of having my boots on the ground a lot with what we're doing today, and actually took this training, the slides that Aaron will be presenting probably 10 years ago, Aaron. So been doing this a really long time. Grateful to be here. I've said this on the last two webinars, for far too long, families and the recovery community, while lockstep on a lot of advocacy issues, we weren't coming to the table and having conversations together. And I think many of our families might agree that for a very, very long time, the recovery community just didn't understand us. So I'm going to hit upon that a little bit today and just share what that journey looks like and some of the challenges that we face. And to the families on here and millions of others, thank you for helping the recovery community change their narrative, right? And so now we're going back with that ask for the recovery community to help us with the family narrative. So I'm super grateful to be here. Thanks, Aaron.
Great. Thank you so much, Denise. And as always, you're right. We've been advocating beside one another and for years, and it's been a pleasure, and I'm glad we're still doing it. And so So let's do a quick exercise here. Everybody can use the chat box. And so we're going to do a little exercise on why language matters. And so collectively, we're just going to come up with a list of some of the words and phrases that you normally hear that describe somebody with a substance use disorder, or somebody that might be struggling, right? So just go ahead and use the chat box and just come up with some lists. Yep, we have junkie, meth head, addict, user, sick, abuser, drug addict, lazy, loser, criminal, loser,
Hey, Aaron, and
crackhead.
maybe for the families, think about what labels have been attached to you, like codependent, enabler, which we'll go over later. So would love to hear some more from that community as well.
Yes, thank you. Black sheep, stoner, codependent, drunk, bad parent. We heard enabler, right? Failure, bad mom, right? We hear all of these. They brought this on themselves, right? Weak, denial, troubled family. Something must be wrong in that house, right? You hear that sort of language used. It's a choice, tweaker, sicko, no willpower, parents' fault, family's often ignored, bad kid, right? So that was a pretty easy list for a lot of us to come up with, right? There's probably reasons for that, right? Next slide, please. Let's go through and look at, these are some of the main ones here, right? You know, we heard you got a number of them, but meth head, pothead, pillhead, crackhead, like all the head ones there. Lush, junkie, alcoholic, addict, loser, criminal, wino, tweaker, hopeless, useless, helpless. And there's more. You all had put a number of more in there. And that's just for, you know, common examples for somebody with a substance use disorder, right? And so in the chat box, let's just, what are some of the similarities that you see just in a lot of these words, or the ones that we came up with here? What are some of the similarities? Go ahead and answer in the chat. They're negative. Yep, Linda. Stigmatizing, the blaming language, single identity, blaming, hurtful, hopeless. Yeah, it's not very empowering, right? Stereotyping, judgmental, discriminatory, uncaring, shaming, mean, one-sided. Yes. And I agree, right? They're all negative. They take away from the person aspect of who we're talking about, who we're labeling, right? And I know that as a person in recovery, I've been in recovery since September 6th of 2003. I've used a number of these words to describe myself at some point, right? You know, at some point, I could have walked down the street and people would, if somebody yelled out, "Hey, junkie," you know, I would have thought that they were talking about me. I would have identified with that. As a result of recovery, I don't identify with some of that language anymore, right? And so this is a lot of the words that we might use are disempowering, dehumanizing. Yep, Logan put a good piece in the chat box there, dehumanizing. It makes people feel less than, right? And I want to take one more second specifically with the top two words there, addict and alcoholic. I know that for many of us in recovery, when we say addict and alcoholic within our recovery circles, there's almost like a bond there, you know? You know, when I say Aaron alcoholic, Aaron addict in recovery circle, and other people in recovery hear that, they kind of like know what I'm talking about. This training is about the public piece, the public narrative, right? That we have private sort of language that we might use with one another in our community. But that public narrative, the second you say addict and alcoholic in public, what do you think the public thinks? Let's use the chat box again, and I'll read that off here. What do you think the public thinks about or hears when they hear addict and alcoholic? Yep. Untrustworthy, fear, active addiction, criminal, no control, criminal, drain on society, a loser, negative, bad person. Yeah. And so it kind of automatically goes to a negative in a lot of people's minds. And also a big reason why I don't use addict and alcoholic in my public narrative when I'm sharing my advocacy story. And this is a big one that I don't think a lot of people think about. If I go out and I say I'm an addict or an alcoholic, people think that I'm still using drugs, or they're like, I hear alcoholic and they're like, oh, that means you love alcohol. Can I buy you a drink? Right. And so it's the perception of how people hear the words that we're using. And so in my recovery circles, and if you belong to a recovery group and you identify as addict and alcoholic, don't change. This training is not to change the language in that environment, right? You stay with that language and identifying in that way in those environments. But outside those environments, whether like outside of support groups, for example, in the public light, when you're advocating, trying to stay away from the word addict and alcoholic is important. When you're talking about solutions, right? You're working to talk towards solutions. All right. And so, Denise, do you have any third ads here? I know you have the next slide, but
yeah, I'll take it on the next slide a little bit, Aaron.
Next one here, Garrett.
Thank you. So if we could just sit in this for 1 second, and then I could piggyback on what Aaron said. So I put 2 labels here. Families, these are the big ones, right? Enabler, codependent. And while we're talking about first person language, I really wanted to speak to the families here and the recovery community so that you can help us educate the public. This is what families hear every day, right? This is the one size fits all advice that we hear every day. So not only are families stigmatized, shamed, and judged, which leads them to isolation and hopelessness, this is our support system here. And this is what we get. That maybe a little bit of Google being our support system until we find organizations like the partnership. So again, I'm going to talk more about this later, but for the families, I think they get this as they sit in it, but for the recovery community, this is what we hear every day, all day. So that also, coupled with what we heard in the chat, bad family, something wrong in that house, we are often also labeled as part of the problem. And thanks for the slide before. I think I recognize so many families here, and I think we're your biggest cheerleaders on changing that narrative. And again, I'm going to make this ask a couple times if the recovery community can just help us understand the journey that we have as well. I think just educating someone and changing what that tired narrative looks like, that black and white advice that we often get.
Can you talk about that one on the top right a little bit, the piece of like they must hit rock bottom? Because I do hear a lot of people in recovery say that, and it's never sat with me well. And so can you talk about that for a minute as a like in terms of like how a family hears that and everything?
Sure. So I'm definitely going to hit this on another slide, but often what we're told, and sorry about the so-called experts that counsel us or that we hear in meetings, is that there's nothing we can do. They have to experience pain and suffering before they're willing to reach out for help. For all of us on here, we know that's not true. It's harmful. So many of our families, many might be on this call, what I hear time and time again, the rock bottom for those families was losing their child. We must do better than that. And there are evidence-based solutions. And we have research that shows that it doesn't work, right? Maybe that's worked for some. I can't speak for everyone, but the science informs us that it doesn't. So to me, let me put that question back at you and the rest of the group. What is your definition of rock bottom? I assume we would get back 100 definitions because it's not a term that's defined for our field and for those of us struggling in the dictionary. It can mean so many things. For
Mhm.
our family, it meant our son living on the streets for 6 months. That's shameful. You know, you were honest, you told the truth that you had a slip. So we're going to kick you out and put you on the streets. And we know living on the streets is going to be your rock bottom and you're going to get better. So shame on society and our so-called experts. You probably shouldn't ask me that question, Harry, because I get really fired up. But
Well, no,
I'll share
I
some
love,
more.
thank you so much for sharing that because, I'm sure that if I'm sitting here watching this as a person in recovery and have that question and want you to, and need to be expanded on it, there's other folks that are here that are thinking the same thing. And so I
Mhm.
appreciate you sharing that. And this is a learning space. And so thank you much.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yep. Are we on, we're moving forward from this one here, this slide here. Great. So just some of the training goals for this afternoon. Just learning about messaging. What's impactful. Learning how to tell our recovery family member or allyship story. That's really what our goal is today, is to help get that ball rolling for people. And just learn how to use an impactful messaging in parts of our lives. And some of us might belong to organizations or an organized recovery community or family groups. How do you talk about what you're advocating for um, uh, collectively in your organizations? How can you have a bigger impact? We have a couple slides working with media and some resources for media um, for folks that are working to expand their message beyond, throughout the media and other public places. And then, we did a webinar a couple months ago on the importance of having your voice heard and advocating and changing public policy. If there's a public policy, if there's a policy in your community or your state that is discriminating against people, that is keeping people from accessing services, then that's something that's something that can be changed through messaging, through advocacy. We often ask why people are speaking out. There's a lot of reasons. Next slide, Garrett, you're fine. Yep. Um, when we ask people, I used to run an advocacy program in New Jersey, and that's how I met Denise. And we had these volunteer advocacy teams. And before we started every single meeting, it met monthly in every county in New Jersey. We'd ask the question, why are you here? What's your name and why are you here? And people's answers are just all over the place, which is great. What inspires people to be here, to be a part of this, just like all of you have different reasons. So I'm just going to list out some of the ones that we commonly hear. Expanding opportunities for recovery, right? Like you hear about recovery community centers, recovery high schools, collegiate recovery programs, reentry services. That stuff doesn't just like come out of nowhere. It needs to be advocated for, right? A lot of family members speak out on behalf of loved ones or our families of loss. A lot of folks speak out because they don't want other families to experience that, right? Want to working with media, mobilize and organize the recovery community. People want to advocate for their rights. A lot of times people don't know that they can speak up about their rights, that they might be being discriminated against by policies, and that people can advocate for what they need. Breaking down discriminatory barriers, building a think and acting local recovery advocacy movement, achieving a just response to addiction as a health crisis. Next slide. And Denise, you can chime in at any point here. There's a lot of reasons why people speak out. That silence, a lot of people, for the longest time, people, because of the shame that might be attached to addiction, right? People did not speak up about addiction for a long time. I think you see on social media and more people in our communities are speaking up now. But when there was that silence and people weren't talking about it, the same way that, like people didn't talk about cancer like 50 years ago, right? And now that they have athletes with like pink bats for breast cancer awareness month, right? Like that stuff happened because people realized that that silence was harmful, right? And in that silence, we let other people's kind of define who we are. And so it's important for family members to speak out and talk about their experiences. It's important for people in recovery to speak out and talk about their lived experiences. That is something that helps change that negative perception, that stigma. There's a lot of people that are voiceless. We work to center advocacy around marginalized communities and people. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Allows us to see a difference between the private and public recovery. I mentioned that, you know, how I speak privately with people about my own personal recovery is different than how I talk about my recovery in a public setting. A lot of folks, I think, learned a certain way of telling their story in like a fellowship or a 12-step program. And that's kind of how a lot of people in recovery had learned how to tell their story. But even that way, there's some harmful language there that we're going to review and try to avoid. That last bit there, we know that the story of like the consequences of untreated addiction, like that's the story that's in the media, right? When you see the result of untreated addiction. And so, well, how do we tell the story of like when people are on the pathway to wellness, or somebody in recovery goes back to college, or there's a family member that started a local group that's helped people, or they started a 5K in their community for addiction awareness, right? How do we tell that story and keep that story going?
Yeah, Aaron, just to
Yep.
add for the positive piece. So first, what I'm thinking here, especially from the family point of view, is who's my audience, right? Because my messaging might change. If I'm speaking, let's say, to the media, for me, and I'll talk to this a little bit later, I have a couple opportunities there. I could be educating them, right? How they can change their narrative, but I can also change the perspective of how they not only look at families in recovery, but the individual struggling. So maybe my advocacy there would be to share a little bit more about all the positive things that my son is doing right now, right? And to paint a different picture, so that there's more dignity and respect toward that individual. That's how we change hearts and minds, right? So that's the media. If I'm sharing, amongst an advocacy group, like today with the recovery community, I'm coming with that ask. Let us be part of the solution with you. Let us work together to change the narrative. So I think who our audience is will really, change what that messaging is. But I think often we have to think about hope, and hope a lot more too, right? It doesn't always have to be negative. So we have to change our language and then bring hope to the story. It's how we change hearts and minds, whether it be the media, policyholders, stakeholders, when we bring this issue to life. And especially think of funders, right? You want somebody to fund you at hundreds of thousands of dollars. If they're only seeing stats on how much loss, which is so critically heartbreaking, they might say, well, there's been so much funding thrown at this already, why should I throw another 100, 200,000, right? But how about we show them all the good stuff happening and how people in recovery and families are thriving, and that we're advocating together, so we can empower them to even give us more funding. So I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Yeah, those stories of transformation and redemption, and there's a lot of amazing things that happen, when people find recovery and give back, right? Or like you see that ripple effect. And I remember I was at well, I'll tell this story later. It has more to do with another slide, but I'll get there. But yes, it's definitely important to think about who your audience is. Like I change some of my messaging if I'm talking to an audience full of like 10th graders or a Chiefs of Police Association. So some of my story is similar, but I changed some of the messaging in it. So next slide here. One of the things I wanted to expand on, talking about committing and centering advocacy around marginalized individuals, marginalized communities, with marginalized individuals, and what we mean when we say that. I the definition of, and this is a personal sort of piece, like my personal definition of being a recovery advocate has evolved throughout the years, and understanding that, you know, communities that are left behind and people that are left behind, the LGBTQI communities, individuals struggle to find services, whether it be housing or culturally competent programs. Um, Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC populations, severely underfunded, underrepresented when we're talking about working to have um, working to have programs that are reaching everybody across the state. There are, you know, the people in recovery, people that are struggling with addiction. You would like to speak with someone in our administrative office, press 2. Oh, somebody needs to mute. We're a, you know, people that use drugs, people that are within substance use disorder are marginalized, but there are marginalized groups within marginalized groups. So to me, like, I know that for me personally, to be a recovery advocate for me means anti-racism work, means work against transphobia, against homophobia, because I know that, you know, talking to people with lived experience that are in LGBTQI communities, for example, and when I think of the barriers that I personally went through, and then I hear from the barriers that they have experienced, we need to dig deeper in terms of the folks that are impacted, marginalized communities that are impacted. So if we're not centering actions and advocacy, local actions around those marginalized individuals and communities, then we're asking people to dig deeper. And this is something that all of us kind of have to go, you know, we're at different levels of it, and it can be frustrating. But as the more we talk about it, the more we keep it on the forefront. And you know, when we're training people on how to talk about recovery and impacted communities, these marginalized communities are heavily impacted and do not have the voice or platform that a lot of us have. And so if we are not including marginalized individuals and communities at the table when we're advocating, we need to dig deeper. And so I just wanted to spend a minute and say that out loud. Next slide, please.
Hey, Aaron, before we leave this one, I think you just came up with our next webinar after Mobilize. I think it's really important. I think we're all trying to do a better job here, but would love a training on what that might look like and bring together the diverse community that you work with and really hit those topics and learn more. I think all of us here remain teachable and we can do better. So just wanted to serve that up while you're on there. Also in the chat, I just want to mention, people were saying, you know, there's other derogatory terms that can stigmatize people. Some of the examples were, you know, criminal justice and disability. I think off the top of my head, drug court. What's wrong with health and wellness court or recovery court? So I just wanted to acknowledge a few in the chat. Thanks.
I appreciate that, and I know a number of we have RAP works with a fantastic caucus, the Inclusivity Caucus, that's that's chaired by Carol Cruz, who I know is here today, and you know, I think that we've done a number of diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings for a recovery advocacy project. We would love to do that on a national scale, and so thank you for making that note there, Denise. All right, next slide. So when we say recovery community, and this is you know, Denise and I, we've talked about this a lot, where you know, I use the the phrase recovery community so often that in my mind, when I say that, I'm talking about people in recovery, impacted family members, friends, and allies, but it's not always heard that way, right? We Recovery Advocacy Project had a number of trainings and events last year, and every once in a while we'd have a family member come in and be like, "Hey, am I allowed to be here?" Like, yes, you are. And so it is important for us when we say recovery community to say what that is out loud. Because there are so many advocacy pieces that are, you know, we align with, right? Like we are on the same page of working to get help for folks. And so, Denise, did you have anything else there to add before we move on?
I don't think so. The only thing I like to challenge sometimes, and it might be on another slide, and challenge might be the wrong word, but how we identify ourselves in recovery. I think, is that on another slide? Because I'd love to
Yes.
hit it. Okay,
Yep,
I'll stop
definitely.
talking.
Next slide. One of the things that we talk to people about, just in terms of, you know, we refer back to many pathways to recovery. Like when we say recovery advocacy, we're not talking about advocating for one particular pathway, you know, or not even the pathway that I came through. We're not advocating for more members of a 12-step fellowship, for example. There, I, you know, this is something that I had to look at some of the biases that I personally had. Like I had biases with medication-assisted recovery. I had biases with faith-based programs until I really, you know, harm reduction, right? There, you know, until I had longer conversations with people that were in recovery from those other pathways, I had those biases. And so one of the things that we challenge people to look at is if you do have a bias against another pathway, really ask yourself why, and maybe talk to some people that are in faith-based programs or are in harm reduction services. It is really important to talk to people um, that are in other pathways other than our own, so that way when we say we're advocating for recovery, it's more inclusive it's not discriminatory against any particular pathways. Next slide. And so I think some of us might know Bill White. Bill White is an author and recovery historian, and if you go to williamwhitepapers.org, he's basically written a blog or a paper on almost anything from family services to recovery community centers to recovery oriented systems of care. And he really helped shape some of the language that we're going to learn today. And he says, you know, many of us have carried a message of hope on a one-on-one basis. He's talking about that like sponsor-sponsee sort of relationship or clinician to, you know, peer-to-peer sort of piece. But he's talking about how this new recovery movement calls upon us to carry that message of hope and whole communities and whole culture. So, and then he's challenging us by saying it's time we step forward to shape this history with our stories, our time, and our talents. Next slide. And then he also wrote this great paper on williamwhitepapers.com called The Rhetoric of Recovery Advocacy that I highly recommend people dive deeper. And he just talks about by claiming the right to speak publicly and frame their experiences in their own language, and this includes family members. Recovery people are politicizing in the best sense of the term what up until now have been private experiences. And so it might feel weird kind of talking about something that's private or personal to you and how you shape that into something that's public. But hopefully some of the language that you're going to learn today really helps with that. Next slide. So yes, and so very simply, what's a message is what the information you want, information using words, the most important information you want your listener to hear. I know people that repeat their message. Like if I do a media interview, I'm going to repeat some things because chances are that's what's going to get picked up in the media interview, right? And so it's important to stay on message. There are ways that people try to take you off message. We're going to talk about that too. And the next slide, please. Some of these we're going to go through pretty quick. We can skip over this one. But it is based on research. It's not like it's not like anybody sat behind a desk and just came up with this today. It's some of the stuff you're going to learn about today. Next slide. This is stuff that, they asked focus groups, and they asked people, hey, are you comfortable with saying you're an addiction survivor? And people were like, no, and so like they tested out different phrases with people, and that's important for us to understand that. Denise had mentioned we've been doing this training for 10 years or so, and so there's been tens of thousands of people that have gone through a training like this. And it helps to have effective, credible language that you can use to talk about your life and experiences. Know how, Denise had mentioned this, knowing how to use the message in different situations, like you might tweak it depending on the audience. That is important. And people are speaking out to make it possible for more people to find recovery, and share why you're speaking out as an advocate. And so when we ask you to write your paragraph in a little bit, that's what we want to kind of get you to work towards. Introduce yourself, why you're speaking out, what you're advocating for. That's all we're asking people to do a little later. Next slide. Next slide. It's just important to understand that, it's not, we're going to talk about messaging, but like, we don't want everybody to sound like robots, right? So we're going to have the trick is to how to weave some of this effective messaging into your story. And so our stories are different, obviously, and our reasons for being here are different, but we want to provide some of that language and messaging that's going to be impactful. Denise and I are both going to talk about this sort of piece here. There are things for all of us to think about when considering speaking out as an advocate, whether you're in recovery or a family member. When people ask me to share my story, I ask them, well, where is it going? Right? Why am I being asked for that? Like, I will not speak up. Like, I will not share my story with like a treatment a treatment center that just wants to put my story on their web. I don't know, if I don't know about that treatment center, or if I didn't go there. I never spent a day in treatment in my life personally. So why am I personally gonna tell my recovery story for a treatment center? And so it's important for all of us to really kind of take a look at that. Are you speaking up on behalf of a family member? Do you have consent for that, right? Is that something that a conversation you should have? Is the timing right? Is parts of your story triggering or harmful for you? It's important to look at that. I know that in my early recovery, I didn't speak out for the first 3 years of my recovery. And then after 3 years, I was like, yeah, I can start speaking out. But it's for all of us to really look at that and determine if we are ready and able. And so you might not take this training and start speaking out right away. And that's all right.
Hey, Aaron. Oh, I'm sorry. No, maybe we can either put in the link or after share our Share Your Story webinar that we did last month. I'm sorry I interrupted you. I thought you were saying next slide. But really, thinking about those moments, what were the challenges that you had? Thinking about it personally too. Am I ready? Is this too raw for me? Right? Practice with family members. I think also really digging in, and Aaron mentioned this, especially for us family members, whose story is this, right? So often we think we have to share the story of our loved one. We can share family recovery, the family journey, the challenges, the barriers, the broken system, the lack of support. I'll stop listing. But there's so much of our story we can share, because I think even those in this field, but let's also think about the percentages that were up before of the people that are not in it. It's an opportunity to share with society what this looks like, right? And maybe you gain a new advocate that maybe doesn't have a personal experience with this, but gets really passionate and cares once they hear that story. So we will share the why behind sharing your story, both personally and then the advocacy driven reasons for sharing your story, and then give you a whole list of what to think about in those moments. I'm just kind of like prompting questions that will help you as well.
Yeah, we can in the follow-up email to this, we can include a link to the video of the last one too. It's kind of, this is like the second part to that initial training. Yes, and so it's a good 1-2 combination there. Next. We have a couple slides I'm going to run through pretty quick. There's a great resource called Advocacy with Anonymity. If you happen to belong to a 12-step, and I saw some conversation in the chat around some of this too, and so it's important to, the messaging that you're going to learn does not violate traditions of your 12-step fellowship. I remember when I first took this training, I was like, well, isn't that breaking anonymity? And I just had this misperception about what anonymity meant. And so there's a great pamphlet, you can Google it. It's called Advocacy with Anonymity. It is, there's a PDF you can just download, and we can probably include it as a link in the follow-up email too. And it's in Spanish as well, and so you can easily find that online. It's a great tool. Next slide. It's a great tool to talk to other people that might be in a fellowship that really kind of there's some misunderstandings around what anonymity means and what it doesn't mean. There's a couple traditions that deal with anonymity, but what breaks down, I'm never talking as a spokesperson for a 12-step group. Right, I'm advocating for recovery, and those are two very different things. And so, through all the years that I've been speaking out as an advocate, we never once mentioned the 12-step group by name. So the pamphlet basically comes down to this means you can speak out about your own recovery and advocate for the rights of others as long as you don't involve the 12-step group by name. And it seems like more and more people kind of get that now these days. So next slide. Oh, we still have people joining us. I love this. So when you're thinking about your message, think about a couple things. Is it authentic, right? I mean, it's all right for us to have a kind of a raw story when talking about loss or talking about recovery, when talking about just how you've been impacted around addiction. It's not easy. And so the authenticity piece is like not hard to generate, right? The one thing that if you tell your story a lot, just ask yourself if you've lost some of that. Like I know that I try to keep myself in check when I speak out. Like, does it sound like I've told my story 100 times or 1,000 times? And so authenticity is having that and then clarity and then appeal. And so these are impactful messaging requires the three of these. And so if you can think about if you think about how your story can have those three components, keep that front and center. Next slide. So in a couple minutes, we're going to ask you to just write a couple sentences. It doesn't have to be too, it's just, you can go like 2 or 3 sentences, maybe 4. But in that sort of structure, we're going to ask people to identify yourself, state your relationship to recovery, or whether it's self, family, or allyship, right? Describe what recovery means to you or family support services means to you. This is all can be, it can all be, it's just a guide. We want you to write your story, but this is just a kind of a guide, explaining why you're sharing your recovery status or explaining why you're speaking out that day. And so that's, you can kind of adjust and whether you're a family member or person in recovery, but this is the general sort of frame that we want people to follow. And we're going to go through a couple slides that talk about some language if you identify as recovery, a family member, or an ally. Next slide. Great. This is for messaging for a person in recovery. When I started using this messaging personally, it really kind of helped me to talk about the solutions and stay positive. And it wasn't like my addiction story; it was my recovery story. And so this propels you to start talking about solutions in that positive sort of language. So I personally say, my name is Aaron Kacharski. I'm a person in long-term recovery, which means that I haven't had a drink or a drug since September 6th of 2003. And so that's how I cover that first 1 and 2 right there. Now, some of us, if you're in early recovery, maybe you don't feel like you're in long-term recovery, but it is up to the person to define that. You can say I'm in recovery, or I'm in sustained recovery, or you can say I'm in early recovery, which means, right, like you can adjust all of this. And then some helpful messaging talking points for people in recovery are listed there. But you want to really kind of explain the how, and the why, because I can say something like, long-term recovery has given me new hope and stability, but how? Like, how has that helped, right? I know people that have gone back to school. I know people that have been gainfully employed since they've been in recovery. I know people that give back to their community, that vote, that are civically engaged, right? Those are all positive things. They do advocacy work. They help others. They started a business. The list goes on, right? Or you say something like, I've been able to create a better life for myself, my family, and my community. Okay, but how, right? And then share about why you're speaking out. I'm speaking out because, I think there should be recovery community centers in every county across America, right? Like that. What is your reason for speaking out, right? Next slide. We're going to come back to these while we're developing your paragraph, but
Hey, Aaron, I just want to talk about the first one. And if we just go back for 1 second, Garrett, I'm so grateful that you fused in the different ways that we can identify ourselves in the early recovery. I know for especially those who have recently relapsed or maybe early recovery, sometimes identifying as I have not used alcohol and drugs in a number of years can sometimes feel intimidating, right? What if I'm using harm reduction right now? What if just meeting people where they're at? I think of the individuals, and we hear from the families every day that, they were, 3 years in recovery and hit a bump in the road, right? And they go back to AA, and this is not me bashing, I'm just trying to paint this picture here, and they're all the way back to getting their first chips 29 days from now. So I love that you fused in the other ways that we can talk about this, and maybe we can give those examples. Because sometimes too, to that person in early recovery, it's like setting that bar so high, excuse me, and can I achieve this? So thank you for that. That's where I was going to come back and say, can we have some other examples?
Yeah, this is all adjustable, right?
Yep.
It's meant to be a guide for, because like we said, there's a lot of reasons why people are on this call, on this
Yep.
webinar today. And so next slide, I just wanted to show some examples. That's a very good friend of mine, Heather in New Jersey, who speaks out a lot. And she just kind of gave an example of how her personal story has evolved. And so just she's a lot more direct, and you notice the one on the right is pretty short. So she's a lot more direct in terms of what she's working to advocate for. Says person in recovery or long-term recovery. She says she's a mother in recovery. Sometimes I've heard her say that too. Some substance use disorder, mental health issues. Recovery has given me a wonderful life, and speaking about it today because I want everybody to know that recovery is real, recovery is possible, and that everyone should have equal access to finding their own pathway to recovery. And so that's her message, right? That's her little paragraph. And so we're going to ask people to kind of work on yours too. So just like Heather did, just a couple lines. Next slide. For family members. This is for family members that are identify as being in recovery too, right? This is family members in recovery. It's similar to that first slide where, my son, daughter, husband, wife, or you can say my family member, hasn't used alcohol or drugs for X amount of years. So obviously this all can be adjusted. If there's healthier aspects, right, of your life since the person, your loved one's found recovery, there's some great language here that you can use in terms of, we become healthier together, enjoying family life in our home. And then share about why you're speaking out. Speaking out because maybe you wanted to make it possible for other people to find sustained recovery, or other families should get the support that they need. as family members. And so there's a lot of, this is all can be adjusted. So we're just kind of going through these a little bit. Denise, do you have a piece here that you wanted to add?
No, I think this is great. I love how you did Heather's transition, right? But families, I think so many of us, right? We just don't want another family to experience maybe the journey that we've been on, right? And so again, a little bit different. We might be speaking to the resources that are out there, why resources aren't out there. If you look for family supports, you don't often see them. So we can just think of the, the broken system of care, whether that was parity, so that people understand that people are not having treatment either, that our loved ones are being denied. So I think it's a different story. And we can give you some examples, and maybe some of our family members could write in the chat and we could take some of those examples. That would be great.
Yeah, Michelle had just asked in the chat, well, if you're a family member of loss, right, that messaging might look a little different, talking about some of the barriers that might have been
exactly,
and why you're advocating, staying in that realm of like why you're speaking out as a family member of loss, like that is an important message. It's powerful, and it's something that people need to hear.
And so
what are some of the changes that you're advocating for, right?
Right.
As right.
And so just to piggyback on that, and so often there's already legislation there, right, that we could link that story to. So, especially our families of loss, was naloxone not available? Were the Good Samaritan laws not in place? Was the X waiver, not in place, where they denied any kind of MOUD? There's a million different reasons and stories, especially those with loss and struggling, that are already connected to some legislation. And if they're not, then we find those voids where we need to do better, and speak to policymakers. Again, we will share that other webinar where we give some of those touch points.
Yep. Next slide. And some of this might be expanded on the next slide too, because there's some messaging around allies, allies in recovery. Maybe somebody doesn't identify as a person in recovery, but maybe they're a supporter of recovery or a family member. You can use some of the stuff on this slide too. I know a lot of people that are inspired by people in recovery, right, or who overcome that adversity. And then some, there's some talking points here too that some folks have kind of weaved in and out of their messaging. And this is newer to the training. I think it's still kind of being shaped and worked on and tested out, and just but there's some pieces here that I think would help, especially talking about creating more opportunities for people to get help or find recovery, right? Next slide. And then and so there's this great section here of before we just kind of ask people to write their paragraph or their couple lines. There's some language that we definitely want to look out for and not use. And so Bill White's back here again. He says, words have immense power to wound or heal. The right words catalyze personal transformation, right? And that's so true. And offer invitations to citizenship and community service. The wrong words stigmatize and disempower. And so we're just going to kind of review some of those wrong words that might stigmatize and disempower. So let's go to the next slide real quick. So here's some of this is just thinking about language in terms of substance use disorder. Some words and concepts that we want to abandon in the recovery messaging. The word abuse, you see a lot of organizations taking the word abuse out of their name, like drug abuse, or because when people hear the word abuse, they think of a lot of other different things, negative, right? It goes to domestic, it goes to other forms of abuse, and so that has been really kind of taken out. Untreated alcoholic, untreated addict, for the same reason that sometimes when people hear addict and alcoholic, they think, it's like they automatically go to that negative there, right? The self-help and the language of self-pity, that's just kind of like the poor me sort of language. I think that like when you think about how people really get well, it often involves the majority of the time communities and supports and resources. So the self-help sort of language is not really like a part of the recovery messaging. These two here are really, there's a reason why clean and sober, like I don't use clean and sober in my public narrative, and I'll explain that. Because when people hear clean, like what is the opposite of clean? People would say dirty, right? And so the reason why, I know that if people belong to a certain fellowship or whatnot, and you use that language with other people in recovery, people understand that, like your clean date, right? But the opposite is when I look at my years of addiction, like I'm like I don't I wouldn't describe it as like a dirty person or dirt, you know what I mean? So it's like how people hear it, how people perceive it. And then sober's another one, because I have friends that they'll say something like, yeah, I'm going to be sober this weekend, or which is a totally different definition of my version of sober, right? And so it gets kind of confusing when people, so it's just about how it's heard or how it's perceived. There's some words and concepts and to discuss and debate. So the treatment work sort of piece. So when there's a difference between saying treatment works and treatment works for me in your messaging, because if you say treatment works and you have an audience and there's somebody in that audience that they're in and out of treatment, in and out of treatment, in and out of treatment, they'll be like, no, it doesn't, and they're not going to listen to you. But if you say something like, I had experience in clinical treatment and it worked for me, people hear that differently. And so just in how you talk about it in your context, the words consumer, client, and patient, when I hear the word consumer, I think of somebody that's like sucking up the system or it's like buying something, which a lot, so for a state to refer to people as like consumers is odd, because I think that people in recovery give back to their community. When people get well and work towards wellness, they give back to their communities, right? And so they're not sucking up anything, not sucking up the systems in that way. And so stigma, enable, and relapse, I think that Denise, you probably want to chat on this too, because that word enable, right? Recovering and recovered, I think depending on how people use some of this stuff, like when I think about relapse, you hear more and more people say use recurrence, or there's another one that I heard the other day, a return to use or something like that. That is not, it's not as stigmatizing, right? Even the word stigma can be stigmatizing, and we don't always, we should, depending on the context. But I know somebody personally that tells their reoccurrence or relapse portion of their story in an impactful way, where they say, hey, I've been in recovery since he was in recovery since like the 70s or something like that, and he had a recurrence of use in the 90s or something like that. But he always talks about the fact that like it didn't, it's not like he had to start over, like he is somebody that he continued to give back to his community. He had a recurrence of use. Denise, did you want to chime in here?
Yeah, I mean, I have this on another slide coming up, but
okay.
I can certainly speak, for 1 second on enable. Just an overused word applied to, especially, the family journey, loving someone, supporting someone, advocating for their health care. It's not enabling. And so we don't use the word enabling, at our organization and many of our partner organizations, because it's, again, overused and misunderstood. And I'll hit that a little bit on a slide in a minute.
Okay, excellent. We'll get to it. Very good. Next slide here. So this is a great resource. This is Robert Ashford out in Pennsylvania. Did these great resources. We can include this in the follow-up email too. But there's like some positive sort of words listed on the left side of the screen there. And then on the right side, there's some negative sort of pieces like substance abuse or relapse, medication-assisted treatment. Instead of using some people use medication-assisted recovery or pharmacotherapy. Instead of saying addict or alcoholic, person with substance use disorder, like that's what we're talking about when we're talking about person-centered language. Next slide. I think this is you here, Denise, the next slide. There you are.
Yeah, we might have skipped another one, but we're running over time, which is totally fine. So I will help. There was one other slide here that will really help you change the narrative on enabling rock bottom, tough love, all that wonderful advice that we get at every turn. And maybe I'll send that to you, Garrett and Aaron, and we could just share that slide. Again, sometimes for us family members, it's about messaging, but also about educating our audience, regardless of who that audience is, so that they have a better understanding, not only of us families, but the journey that we travel and the one size fits all advice that we get. And sadly, why so many families have lost, right? We hear from the experts that, advice again and again, right? We're not hearing the evidence informed or science informed. So we'll share that with you. Another way we can change the conversation is with the media. Aaron mentioned before, interviews, right? So often our lovely media and journalists like to sensationalize a story. And often they'll ask you questions of what they want that story to be. Or maybe switch what that story might be by the time you get on an interview is just one example. That's a wonderful opportunity to just serve up a few things about the language that you use and what you're willing to speak to or not. For me, if that interview ends there, I'm okay with that. I'd rather an interview or an op-ed or a letter to the editor, whatever that might be, I'd rather them not utilize something that's not from my heart and from, authenticity. And if they're not willing to, just get some education and really try to understand the journey that those suffering and their families are on, then I'm okay with that. I don't need something to be published. So right here, we just have, there's a press storybook that we could maybe send to you in the link. And just, even if you're on social media, sometimes I might see it, an article, for example, on recovery, but a spoon and needle, which has nothing to do with recovery, right? So it's got the sensationalized image, has nothing to do with the story. And then also you open it up and there's a lot of stigmatizing language. I send them the press style book. That's all I do. Thank you for your time, attaches a link to the press style. So that's just a 1 second or a 10-second, lift for us, right? Just to educate the public. I think, as I said here together, we can all, play a really important role here. Some lighter lifts and some heavier lifts. So we will get you the style book link and then also the slide.
Excellent.
Thanks.
Next slide here. All right, and so what we're going to ask you to do, we're actually, for the sake of time, let's just use the chat box here, just to write out a short little message. I see Tammy did it earlier, right? So we can kind of go through some of the reminder slides too, but just write out a couple sentences in the chat box introducing yourself, name, your relationship to recovery or family support, and why you're speaking out, what you're advocating for. Just really simple in the chat box. Let's give people a couple minutes to use some of the to share there. Actually, is Nathan still on here? Yeah, Nathan. I was going to ask Nathan to share his recovery story real quick as people are coming up with their own. Nathan Mitchell in Virginia.
Sorry, I have to shut my door.
There you are. All right. Yeah, I was just going to ask you if you can give, I know you've done the training before, so I was wondering if you could take just a minute to share just how you introduce yourself and what you're currently advocating for, and just using some of the language that we reviewed today.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. My name is Nathan Mitchell, and my pronouns are he and him. I'm a person in sustained recovery from a substance use disorder. For me, That means I haven't used drugs or alcohol for a little over 3 years. I have the opportunity to become a better person every single day. I have the opportunity to share my recovery to help the next person. And I have the opportunity today in recovery to be a better son, a better nephew, a better grandson, a better uncle, a better brother, and also importantly, a better advocate for the recovery community. I advocate today to increase access to recovery support services around the country. So thank you for letting me share.
I love that, Nathan. Thanks. So it's very, very simple, very direct, right? It's positive, staying on message. And do we have a family member that wanted to just share a quick paragraph? Or I don't know if Denise, if you wanted to do a quick intro here. Let me see. Let's we got some stuff in the
Did you say, I want to give an opportunity. Is there someone there? Did you say Virginia?
Oh yeah, I mean there's a bunch of people on, but I'm just trying to figure out who Garrett, maybe you can, if folks could virtually raise your hand or like wave at the screen if you don't mind sharing your 1 minute story. Garrett will take you off of mute. I just want one more example, preferably if you're a family member that wants to share, that would be great. It's not limited. I know Michelle is on here. We have any takers? If not, you can just put your messaging in the chat box. And so we want to just kind of take some of these tools and you know, have this be the beginning. You know, I realize if it's new to you, you're probably still working on your paragraph and your sentences, and so it doesn't have to be perfect or anything like that. But let's see if one more. Is there anybody that wants to share here what they wrote in their sentences? We got some good language in the chat. Here's Diana Lunas. Hey, I will take you off of ask to unmute. All right, Diana, you should see a little button there where you can unmute yourself.
Am I unmuted?
Yep, go ahead. Thank you for volunteering.
Hi, my name is Diana Lunas, and I am a parent of 4 children, 2 of whom have passed. My oldest son in 2014, my oldest in 2008, and my youngest in 2014. I've been working in advocacy with many groups since 2014, and I also have been presenting workshops for the Compassionate Friends for 8 years for parents like me who have lost their children to substance use related causes. Recently, I became connected with a partnership, and I feel very strongly that as a parent coach, I'm able to provide hope, real hope, to parents through the tools that I have learned and the things that were not available to us as a family. Back in those days, recovery and treatment, both of the boys were involved in treatment for many months. They were isolated from us. And I can only feel that when they came out, they felt even more shame and more isolation because the parenting style that they were used to was taken away from us while they were gone in treatment. They came back without all the harm reduction tools that now exist, and the community. Back then, the community, they were largely older people who didn't relate to young people. And so I feel very strongly about doing what I can to give them a voice, and because they don't have one. Through me, they can, and I can help others so that they don't have to go through this kind of loss.
Thank you so much thank you so much for sharing. I know I can hear it in your voice how passionate you are to make the changes and talking about something that is personal and important to you. And I love how you talked about the work you're doing with the parent coaching and the type of system that you want to see, talking about some of those solutions, right? Like you did a great job working towards, hey, this is what I'm advocating for. This is what can be possible, right? Denise, did you have any feedback there too?
No, I can't thank you enough, Diana. And again, led it to what she's doing today, but also what I heard is celebrating their sons at the same time, and just using that. All that kind of went wrong, and like she said, the transition of the parenting skills. It's through services of the RAP and the partnership and the parent coaches is how we can save lives. And so we are forever grateful. I put this in the chat too to all the families on here that it lost. We thank you for your selfless work and passion to help other families. And maybe that's one family a day, one family a month. That's what all this is about, changing hearts and minds, and then making others accountable. We can no longer serve up a black and white system of care for our loved ones without any supports for families. It's unacceptable. So thank you for sharing that, Diana.
Yeah. Just for the sake of time, we're just gonna thank you so much if you shared out loud here, or if you shared in the chat box. I appreciate that. And whether it's your first time doing it or you've done it a couple times, we hope that this training is helping. Next slide. You can skip over the next 4, Garrett. This is just this piece right here is a repeat. Yes, back one. Back 2 maybe. Okay. Yep, this is perfect. And so just some of the things that you might want to add in terms of like incorporating into your stories. There's some great pieces here, like lived experience or living proof, recovery-oriented systems of care, family support services, recovery support services. You heard Diana use coaching, talking about coaching, and you heard in Heather's story earlier, recovery is a reality. There's pieces of gratitude, service, responsibility, story, like those are all positive sort of pieces here. And so you can weave some of this stuff into your story. Next slide. When can you use this? Always. I think to think about how you might learn best. I learned through writing, and so I've been doing a lot of, like, I used to go to like an article around addiction and see all the anonymous comments that were stigmatizing on the online article from people that didn't understand addiction. So I used to write a lot in comments and blogs and articles, and so you can do it in your actions, in your public policy call to actions. You can do it with media, elected officials. Just use this always. We actually have a good, I don't know if Garrett, if you can share this in the chat. We have a great letter writing campaign that's to governors right now that uses some of this person-centered language and around recovery, and talking about why recovery would be important to you. If you want to, thank you, Garrett. If you want to take that action that I think Garrett just dropped in the chat, this is something that is just investing in recovery. And it has some of this person-centered language, and we're working to get tens of thousands of letters on this. And so if you can take that action, that'd be great. But you can, I know that partnership does a lot of call to actions, and so sometimes you can add some of your own language on some actions. And if you want to ever draft a petition for something or do a letter writing campaign, Recovery Advocacy Project can help you with that. And help with some of the language. And so think about what's going on in your communities, what's going on in your state, and what you want to have your voice heard. And we'd be more than happy to help create some actions around what's happening. Next slide. I think we're on the last one here. It's just another Robert Ashford piece. We're going to send this to you all so you have it. It just kind of talks about when to use different words and when not to. And then finally, on this last slide, just there's some more resources out there if you want to dive deeper. At recoveryvoices.com, we have an advocacy guide that has a lot of how-tos, and some of those how-tos are around messaging, like how to effectively deliver public testimony or speak out as a recovery advocate or do a press release with media advisories or a letter to the editor. We have all of that mapped out on our website. Denise had recommended a great resource. It's called the Addictionary, which is a glossary of substance use disorder terminology. So sometimes we might say some things that are confusing and you're like, oh, I might have to look that up. The Addictionary is a great resource there. And I mentioned WilliamWhitePapers.com, and Faces and Voices of Recovery.org has a lot of messaging tools as well. And they originally were the drafted pieces of this training. And so we thank our friends over at Faces of Addiction and Recovery as well. Denise, I think the next one, there's one more, and then we're wrapping up.
Yep. I think it's the next one. We have a Get Involved page 2. I'll just share in 30 seconds, and you can email me. I put it in the chat. We are also launching a new project in the next couple weeks, which is Help Us Change the Addiction Story. And so we're doing a call for stories. We have a recorded webinar to help you with that. And what we're doing there is, collecting the different moments that we spoke about for and the different challenges that you might have faced, whether it be naloxone, Good Sam laws, parity, lack of MOUD. What we're doing is matching that to legislation and just really putting almost like the journey and the many different touch points. And sadly, I think we have over 60 touch points on that system of care. So anybody wanting to know more about that, just give me a shout in an email, and we will be launching soon too, so you can look for that.
Yep, I think the last slide has both of our emails on it, and so feel free to reach out. Marcia usually is joining us as a presenter. She had a scheduling conflict, but she'll be back for the next one, I'm sure. And so, but if you need to reach out to either of us, our emails are there. Feel free to do that. I know a lot of folks reached out to me after the last one, and so just give me some time. There's a lot of folks all that email me at once. It might take me a little bit, but I will get back to you. And
a huge thank you from Aaron and I and RAP and the partnership. Again, I'll start where I left off. It's been a personal and professional dream to bring the recovery community and families together. I think it sounds cliche, but together we're stronger. And I think we just complement each other. And we know when we know better, we do better. And so really grateful for this opportunity.